The morning of October 14th didn't feel like the end of a world. It felt like any other Tuesday in Silverwood Falls. The gray, persistent mist was clinging to the evergreen trees, and the air carried the sharp, cold scent of impending winter. Inside the house on North Ridgeway, a house I had spent 14 years maintaining, with my own two hands, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. I was sitting at the head of the oak dining table, a cup of coffee in my hand that had long since gone cold. I wasn't drinking it. I was staring at the screen of my phone. The text from Diane had arrived at exactly 6:42 a.m. It was short. It was clean. It was lethal. Plans changed. You're not coming on the cruise. Chloe wants her real dad there. It's a family thing. Grant, don't make it difficult. I read it once, then twice. By the 10th time, the words started to lose their meaning, turning into jagged black marks against a white background. Real family. The phrase sat in my gut like a lead weight. I looked around the kitchen. The granite countertops I had installed 3 summers ago. The custom cabinets I'd spent weekends sanding until my fingers bled. The light fixture Diane had pointed out in a catalog and whispered, "It would make our home perfect." Our home. I stood up slowly, my joints feeling stiff as if I'd aged a decade in minutes. I walked to the sink and poured the cold coffee down the drain. The dark liquid swirled and vanished, much like the last 14 years of my life seemed to be doing. I didn't reply. What was there to say? How do you argue with a line that has been drawn in permanent ink? The ghost in the hallway walked down the hallway toward my home office. But I stopped at the wall of memories. That's what Diane used to call it. It was a collection of framed photos, arranged in a perfect gallery style. I looked at one, from Chloe's high school graduation. There she was, glowing in her cap and gown, flanked by Diane. I was there too, standing just half a step behind them, my hand resting on the back of Diane's chair. I looked closer. I had always thought I looked proud in that photo. Now, with the scales fallen from my eyes, I realized I looked like an intruder. I was the man who paid for the party, the man who bought the gown, the man who ensured the college tuition was settled, but I wasn't in the inner circle. I was the support beam that they had decided they no longer needed. Because the roof was finally stable, that my mind drifted back to the early days. Chloe was only 8 when I met Diane, a skinny girl with messy pigtails and a deep, quiet sadness because Shane Miller, the real dad, had hopped on a bus to Vegas and never looked back. I remembered the first time I held her hand while she got stitches after falling off her bike. I remembered the nights I sat on the floor of her room, helping her with long division until her tears turned into a sleepy smile. We're a family. Now, Diane had told me on our wedding night, tucked away in a small cabin in the mountains. It's you, me, and Chloe, always. She had used that word, family, as a key to my heart and my bank account. The weight of the bill he walked into, the spare bedroom, which I used as a filing area. My father had been a man of ledgers and receipts, and I had inherited that habit. I opened the heavy metal cabinet. The drawer shrieked a sharp, metallic cry that echoed through the empty house. I pulled out a folder labeled Chloe, Education and Health. I sat on the floor and started spreading the papers out. Here were the receipts for the dental surgery Shane never paid for. Here were the monthly transfers for the Silverwood Elite Soccer Club. Diane insisted Chloe join because all the good families were in it. I found the auto-debit confirmation for the anniversary cruise, the one Diane had been hinting at. For 6 months, $5,000. My money. I looked at the date on the cruise confirmation. I had booked it only 3 weeks ago. Diane had kissed my cheek that night and said, "Grant, you always take such good care of us." She was already planning to bring Shane back then. She had waited until the payment cleared, until the tickets were non-refundable. And then she had sent a text message to dismiss me like a hired driver who was no longer needed for the journey. The silence of the house phone buzzed in my pocket. Diane was calling. I didn't answer. It buzzed again. Then a voicemail notification popped up. I hit play, putting it on speaker. Her voice filled the room, sounding tight and annoyed. "Grant, I know you saw the text. Look, don't be dramatic. Shane is back in town, and he's really trying this time. Chloe deserves to have her father with her for once. You've had 14 years with her. Give him this one trip. We'll talk when I get back. Just take care of the house, okay? Love you. Take care of the house. The love you at the end sounded like an afterthought, a habit she forgot to break. I looked at the walls, the floor, the ceiling. I realized then that I wasn't a husband or a father in this house. I was a caretaker. I was the one who made sure the lights stayed on and the grass stayed green, so that the real family could enjoy the view. I stood up, my eyes clear for the first time in years. The hurt was there, deep and burning, but underneath it was something else, a cold, hard clarity. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to do exactly what she asked. I was going to take care of the house, but not in the way she expected. I grabbed my keys and my jacket. As I walked out the front door, I didn't look back at the photos. I looked forward, toward the town of Silverwood Falls, toward the credit union, and toward a future where I finally stopped paying for a life I wasn't allowed to live. The mist was lifting, and for the first time in 14 years, I could see the road ahead perfectly. The drive to the Silverwood Community Credit Union was a blur of gray pavement and flickering streetlights. The heater in my truck was blasting, but I couldn't shake the chill that had settled into my bones, the kind of cold that comes from realizing the person sleeping next to you for over a decade was a stranger. I walked into the bank at exactly 9:15 a.m. The smell of stale coffee and industrial carpet greeted me. I had been a member here since I was 22, long before I ever met Diane. "Morning, Grant." The teller, Susan, said with a polite smile. She'd seen me every Friday for years, depositing checks, setting up Chloe's savings, and managing the household. "What can we do for you today?" "Looking to start another project on the house. I need a full audit of my accounts, Susan," I said. My voice was sandpaper dry and rough. "Everything, checking, savings, the joint household fund, and any scheduled outgoing transfers." Susan's smile faltered slightly as she saw the look in my eyes. She nodded and led me to a private office in the back. A few minutes later, she handed me a thick stack of papers. The ink was still warm from the printer. The paper trail of Deceit sat in that small, windowless office and began to read. I wasn't just looking at numbers. I was looking at the anatomy of a betrayal. The first thing I saw was the cruise payment, $5,240. It had been debited from my personal savings account, the money I had set aside from my overtime hours at the dealership. Diane had told me the cruise was on her this year as a surprise, but she had simply used the login credentials I'd shared with her to pay for it using my own sweat and toil. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. For the last 3 years, there had been a recurring monthly transfer of $450, zero to an external account I didn't recognize. The recipient's name wasn't Shane Miller, but the account was linked to an address in Vegas, the last place Shane had lived. Diane had been subsidizing his life with my money while he was finding himself. I leaned back in the plastic chair, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin. Every time I had skipped a lunch to save money, every time I had put off buying new work boots because the family budget was tight, Diane was sending that money to the man. She was now taking on a cruise. "Is everything all right, Mr. Sterling?" Susan asked, peeking her head in. "I need to make some changes," I said, my voice gaining a new, cold edge. "First, I want to cancel the auto debit for the cruise. Second, I want to revoke Diane's access to any account that isn't strictly joint. And third, I want to see the original deed for the property on North Ridge Way." The fortress of glass. Susan returned 10 minutes later with a digital file. "The house was purchased 14 years ago, Grant. You used the inheritance from your father's estate for the down payment. Because of that, and the way the paperwork was filed back then, the title is solely in your name. Diane is listed as a resident, but she's not on the deed." A wave of relief, sharp and jagged, washed over me. In her rush to keep her independence early in our marriage, Diane had never insisted on being added to the title. She had spent 14 years calling it our home, but legally, it was my fortress. I left the bank and drove straight to a small, cluttered law office downtown. Sandra Thorne was a woman known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue. I laid the bank statements and the deed on her desk. She sent me this text this morning, I told her, handing over my phone. Sandra read the text, her eyebrows rising. Real dad, huh? That's a bold move for someone with zero equity in a 3-bedroom house. She looked at the bank statements and this unauthorized siphoning of funds in many states. That's considered financial abuse, or at the very least, a significant factor in asset division. I don't want a divorce yet, I said. Sandra looked puzzled. Then what do you want, Grant? I want to sell the house, I replied. Immediately. Before they get back from that cruise. The point of no return. Sandra whistled softly. You can do that. It's your name on the paper. But it's going to get loud, Grant. Very loud. When she finds out she's coming home to a house she doesn't own anymore. She's going to come for blood. She already took my blood, Sandra. She took 14 years of it. She took my pride, and she tried to take my daughter's respect for me. She wants a real family. She can have one, but they won't be living under my roof. I spent the rest of the afternoon with Sandra, signing the necessary disclosures and listing agreements. By 4 p.m., I had contacted Sandra Thorne's partner, a high-end realtor. The market is hot. The realtor told me over the phone. A house in Silverwood Falls. I can have a cash buyer in 48 hours if you're willing to move fast. Move. As fast as you can, I told him. I drove back to the house on North Ridgeway. The mist had turned into a steady, freezing rain. I walked through the rooms, looking at the life I had built. The leather recliner I sat in every night. The shelf I'd built for Chloe's trophies. I grabbed a few cardboard boxes from the garage. I wasn't going to take much. Just my tools, my father's old watch, and my clothes. Everything else, the furniture I'd paid for, the appliances I'd repaired, the memories I'd cherished could stay. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a photo from Chloe. It was a picture of her, Diane, and Shane at the airport lounge. They were all smiling, holding up glasses of champagne. The caption read, "Finally, the team is back together." I stared at for a long time. Then I set the phone face down. I picked up a roll of packing tape and pulled it tight. The sound of the tape ripping was the loudest thing in the house. A sharp, final snap. The team was back together, and for the first time in 14 years, I was perfectly happy to be the one who wasn't on the roster. The next morning, Silverwood Falls was swallowed by a thick, suffocating mist that clung to the pavement like a damp shroud. Grant Sterling stood by the window, watching the gray fog roll over his manicured lawn, and realized he had reached the point of no return. There was no anger left, only a cold, surgical precision. He picked up the phone and called Sandra Thorne, his attorney, giving her the final green light to list the North Ridgeway property in as-is condition for an immediate cash sale. He didn't want to haggle over repairs or paint colors. He wanted the house gone, along with every ghost that inhabited it. He began to pack, but this wasn't the rhythmic packing of a man preparing for a vacation. It was the systematic dismantling of a 14-year-old illusion. He went to the garage and opened his heavy, weathered toolbox, running his fingers over the cold steel of the wrenches and hammers he had used to maintain every inch of this house. Every tool held a memory of a weekend spent working to fulfill one of Diane's endless demands: sanding the deck, fixing the plumbing, building the very shelves that held her collections. He realized then that he had been the architect of his own prison. As he worked, his phone sat on the workbench, its screen lighting up incessantly with Diane's name. The cruise line must have finally sent the cancellation notice, and the panic was setting in. Grant didn't answer. He picked up the device, slid it into airplane mode, and set it face down on the cold concrete. He discovered in that moment that silence wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a weapon. By refusing to engage, he was letting Diane burn in the fire of her own uncertainty. He moved through the kitchen like a stranger, clearing out the pantry and tossing every item Diane had bought for their family celebration into a black trash bag. He felt like a shadow in his own home, a ghost that was finally choosing to stop haunting the premises. By late afternoon, a for sale sign was staked into the damp earth of the front yard. Within hours, his realtor called with a cash offer from a young military couple, Caleb and Mia, who were looking for a quick closing. Grant didn't even look at the price. He simply said yes. He didn't need the money as much as he needed the freedom. He loaded the last of his clothes and essential documents into the bed of his truck, leaving the rest of the furniture, the leather sofa, the dining set, the television behind like discarded skin. Before he walked out for the last time, he went to the dining room and looked at the heavy oak table. He took the head chair, the one he had occupied for over a decade, while playing the role of the man of the house, and pushed it firmly under the table. He pushed it in so far that it looked tucked away, hidden, a clear signal that the position was now permanently vacant. He placed the spare keys on the granite counter, next to a stack of unpaid utility bills he had no intention of settling. As he pulled his truck out of the driveway and onto the wet street, he caught one last glimpse of the house in his rearview mirror. Through the front window, he could see the wall of memories, now stripped of the photos he had taken down. The pale squares on the wallpaper where the frames used to hang looked like scars, faint reminders of a trauma that was finally starting to heal. He headed toward the edge of town, toward a small, nondescript rental unit he had secured under his own name, a place where Diane, Shane, and Chloe had no claim and no key. The darkness of the Pacific Northwest night closed in around the truck, the headlights cutting a path through the rain, and Grant felt a physical weight lift from his chest. He was no longer the caretaker of someone else's happiness. He was no longer the man who paid the price for a life he wasn't allowed to lead. He was just Grant Sterling, driving into a future that he would build on his own terms, with his own hands, and for his own sake. The Tuesday the cruise ship docked in Miami was the same day the final wire transfer hit Grant Sterling's new private bank account. Grant sat in a small diner 20 miles outside of Silverwood Falls, watching the rain streak down the windows in long, jagged lines. He had his phone turned on for the first time in 72 hours. The notifications hit like a barrage of gunfire. Dozens of texts from Diane, a handful from Chloe, and even a few missed calls from a number he didn't recognize, likely Shane Miller. Finally finding his voice now that the free ride was being threatened, Grant didn't read them. He didn't need to. He knew the trajectory of a cornered animal. Instead, he pulled up the security feed from the smart camera he'd left hidden in the oak tree across from his former driveway. He watched in high-definition silence as Diane's white SUV pulled into the driveway at 3:18 p.m. She looked exhausted but triumphant, stepping out of the car with a designer shopping bag in one hand and her phone in the other. Behind her, Shane Miller climbed out of the passenger seat, stretching his arms like he owned the air he was breathing. Chloe followed, laughing at something Shane said, looking more relaxed than Grant had seen her in years. They looked like a family. They looked perfect. Diane walked up to the front porch, her heels clicking sharply on the wood Grant had stained just last spring. She reached into her purse for her keys, her movements fluid and practiced. She slid the key into the deadbolt, but it wouldn't turn. She frowned, jiggling the handle, her brow furrowing in confusion. She tried again, more forcefully this time, her shoulder leaning into the door. Inside the diner, Grant took a slow sip of his black coffee, feeling the heat burn his throat. He watched Diane step back and look at the lock as if it had offended her personally. She said something to Shane, who stepped up with a confident smirk, taking the keys from her hand. He tried, his face turning from a grin to a mask of frustration as the key refused to engage. That was when Caleb Morales, the young Army sergeant, who now legally owned the house, opened the door. The chain was still on, revealing only a sliver of his face. The security camera was too far to catch the dialogue, but Grant could read the body language. Diane's hands went to her hips. She was shouting, her face turning a blotchy red. Shane was trying to look intimidating, stepping onto the porch steps, but Caleb didn't budge. He simply held up a piece of paper, the signed deed and the closing documents. The moment it landed was visible in Diane's posture. It was as if the bones in her spine had suddenly turned to sand. She staggered back, her hand reaching out for the porch railing, the railing Grant had reinforced so she wouldn't fall. She looked at the for sale sign that had been flipped to sold and then tossed in the bushes by the new owners. She looked at the windows where her curtains had already been replaced by Caleb's simple blinds. She turned around, looking at the driveway, at the street, at the neighborhood that had known her as the lady of North Ridgeway for 14 years. She was standing on the sidewalk of a life she no longer had a key to. Chloe stood by the car, her phone slipping from her hand, her mouth open in a silent cry of realization. Shane, the man who was supposed to be the real dad, the man who was supposed to be their savior, stood there with his hands in his empty pockets, looking at the ground. He had no house to offer them. He had no bank account to fix this. He was exactly what Grant had always known him to be, a guest who had stayed too long, and finally been handed the bill. Grant turned off the screen. He felt a strange, hollow peace. It wasn't the joy of a win. It was the satisfaction of a math problem finally reaching its inevitable, cold conclusion. He called Sandra Thorne, his attorney. "They're there," Grant said. Sandra sighed on the other end. "I've already received 3 calls from a local firm claiming to represent her. They're talking about emergency stays and a legal displacement. I told them to read the title. I told them to look at the financial records of the last decade. Grant, they have nothing. But it's going to get ugly before it gets quiet." Grant looked at his reflection in the dark diner window. "Let it get ugly," he said. "I've spent 14 years cleaning up their messes. This is the first time they have to stand in the rain they made." He hung up and stood, leaving a $20 bill on the table for a $5 breakfast. He walked out to his truck, the wind whipping his jacket. He was heading further west, toward the mountains, toward a place where no one knew his name, and no one expected him to pay for a cruise he wasn't invited on. The air inside the mediation room at the Scott County Courthouse was thick with the smell of floor wax and the cold, metallic scent of a late October frost creeping through the ventilation system. Grant Sterling sat at one end of the long, mahogany table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He felt like a different species compared to the people sitting 3 feet away. Diane was dressed in a sharp black suit she had bought for a fundraiser. Last year bought with his money, but the poise was gone. Her eyes were rimmed with red, and her fingers were trembling as she shredded a paper napkin into tiny, white flakes. Shane Miller sat beside her, looking profoundly out of place in a borrowed blazer that was too tight across the shoulders. He kept glancing at the door as if looking for an exit that didn't involve facing the man he had tried to replace. Chloe sat at the very end, her eyes fixed on a scratch in the table's finish, her silence heavier than any shout could have been. The mediator, a woman named Mrs. Gable with silver hair and eyes that had seen every flavor of human misery, opened a manila folder inside. "We are here because of a claim of wrongful displacement and a demand for an emergency share of assets from the sale of the Ridgeway property," Mrs. Gable began, her voice a low drone. Diane didn't wait for her to finish. She leaned forward, her voice cracking like thin ice. "It wasn't just a property. It was our life, Grant. How could you? You waited until our backs were turned, until we were at our most vulnerable. And you sold our sanctuary to total strangers. Chloe has nowhere to sleep. I have spent 14 years building that home, and you erased it with a single signature. It's calculated, it's cruel, and it's illegal." Grant didn't blink. He waited for the echoes of her voice to die down in the sterile room. He reached down to the floor and lifted a heavy, leather-bound briefcase onto the table. The thud it made was solid, the sound of a closing door. He didn't look at Diane. He looked at Mrs. Gable. "I didn't erase a home, Diane. I closed a business that was no longer profitable," Grant said, his voice coming from somewhere deep and cold. He opened the briefcase and pulled out the first of many organized stacks of paper. "You talk about 14 years of building. Let's look at the foundation of what you built." He slid a spreadsheet across the table. It was color-coded, meticulously documented, and dated back to the month they moved in. "This is the Ridgeway ledger. Every mortgage payment for 168 months. Every single one came from my personal account. Not once did a cent of your freelance income or Shane's sporadic consulting fees touch this debt. I paid for the roof that kept you dry, the furnace that kept you warm, and the taxes that kept the state from taking it. Legally, the house was mine because I was the only one who ever bought it. You weren't a co-owner, Diane. You were a guest who forgot when the checkout time was. Diane's lawyer tried to interject, but Grant raised a hand, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp intensity that silenced the room. "I'm not finished. You mentioned Chloe being humiliated. Let's talk about the cost of her life." He pulled out another stack receipts from the Silverwood Orthodontics Clinic, invoices from Iowa State University, and the bill of sale for a 2019 Honda. Total investment in Chloe's future, $240,000, all paid by the man she just called her not real dad. And while I was paying for her braces and her tuition, where was the real dad? Grant finally turned his gaze to Shane Miller, who visibly flinched. Grant threw a smaller, thinner folder toward him. It contained the Vegas bank transfers. "Diane has been sending Shane for $150 a month for 3 years. My overtime pay, my weekend shifts at the dealership. She was siphoning the blood of my labor to keep her ex-lover afloat while I was eating leftovers and wearing 5-year-old boots so Chloe could have a laptop for school. You want to talk about cruelty? Cruelty is watching a man break his back to provide for you while you're secretly funding the man you plan to replace him." With the moment the house is paid off, the silence that followed was suffocating. Chloe finally looked up, her eyes wide and searching her mother's face for a denial that wasn't coming. Diane's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the Vegas transfers, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray. She had thought she was being clever, that the small amounts would go unnoticed in the sea of household expenses. She hadn't counted on a man like Grant Sterling, a man who measured his life in the precision of a mechanic. Shane Miller cleared his throat, trying to regain some shred of bravado. "Look, Grant, I know you're hurt, but I'm back now. I'm stepping up. The girl needs her father." Grant laughed then, a short, bitter sound that had no humor in it. "You're not stepping up, Shane. You're stepping in because the buffet is open and you're hungry. But here's the news. The kitchen is closed. I sold the house for cash. The money is in a trust that you will never touch. I've canceled the credit cards. I've revoked the power of attorney. And as of 9 a.m. this morning, I've filed for a formal separation with a request for a total audit of Diane's hidden assets. You wanted your real family back. Well, here they are. You have a woman with no home and a man with no job. I hope your real love can pay for a motel room, because my part in this play is over." Mrs. Gable leaned back, looking at the evidence spread across the mahogany table at the wreckage of a plane crash. She looked at Diane, then at the man who had spent 14 years being a ghost in his own life. "Mr. Sterling has provided documented proof of sole ownership and a clear pattern of financial deception by the petitioner," she said, her voice devoid of sympathy. "There's no legal basis to freeze the sale of the property. The displacement was not wrongful. It was the result of a legal sale of a private asset." Diane let out a low, whimpering sob, her forehead dropping to the table. Chloe stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor like a scream. She didn't look at her mother. She didn't look at Shane. She walked around the table and stood next to Grant. She reached out a hand, hovering it near his shoulder, but she didn't touch him. She didn't know how to touch the man she had participated in erasing. "Dad," she whispered. Grant looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes flickered, but then he remembered the text. "Please respect our space." He stood up, gathered his folders, and tucked them back into his briefcase. "I respected your space, Chloe," he said softly, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "Now, I'm going to go find some of my own." He walked out of the room without looking back, the sound of his boots on the tile floor steady and rhythmic, leaving the ruins of the Montgomery Miller real family to sit in the silence of their own making. The first snow of the season began to fall over Silverwood Falls in late November, turning the lush greenery into a skeletal landscape of white and gray. Grant Sterling watched the flakes drift past the window of his small, one-bedroom cabin perched on the edge of the Wenatchee National Forest. The cabin was a far cry from the suburban grandeur of North Ridgeway. It was made of rough-hewn cedar, smelled of wood smoke and pine, and held only what Grant truly needed: a bed, a sturdy table, his tools, and a silence that no longer felt like a burden. In the weeks following the mediation, Grant had settled into a routine that focused on the restoration of his own soul. He spent his mornings working at a local independent garage, fixing engines that people had given up on, and his afternoons hiking the rugged trails behind his property. He had deleted his social media, changed his number for everyone except his lawyer and his sister, and started the slow process of untangling his identity from the role of the provider. He was learning to cook for one, to sleep in the center of the bed, and to listen to the radio without worrying if the volume was bothering anyone. For the first time in 14 years, his heart rate had slowed, and the constant, buzzing anxiety of trying to please an unpleasant woman had vanished like the mist in the valley. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in a flickering neon-lit motel on the outskirts of the city, Diane's new reality was biting hard. The real family was currently living out of 3 suitcases in a room that smelled of old cigarettes and industrial-strength bleach. Shane Miller, the man who had promised to step up, was finding that the world outside of Vegas was much colder and more expensive than he remembered. Without Grant's steady paycheck flowing into Diane's hidden accounts, their financial situation had disintegrated within weeks. Diane's freelance design work was inconsistent, and her reputation in their social circle had been incinerated the moment the news of the house sale went public. People she once considered friends avoided her at the grocery store, whispering about the woman who had tried to erase her husband only to be erased herself. Shane had spent most of his days at a nearby sports bar, claiming to be networking, while Diane sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the beige walls and wondering how the man she had ridiculed as a simple mechanic had managed to outmaneuver her so completely. The power dynamic had shifted. Shane was no longer the exciting rebel from her past, but a weight around her neck, and Diane was no longer the pampered queen of a suburban castle, but a woman facing the terrifying prospect of a minimum-wage future. Chloe was perhaps the hardest hit by the fallout. She was staying in a cramped dormitory at Iowa State, her once limitless credit card now a piece of useless plastic in her wallet. She had called Grant's old number 100 times, only to be met with a number disconnected recording. She had reached out to his sister, who told her in no uncertain terms that Grant needed his space, and that Chloe had made her choice clear on the day of the text message. Chloe's grades were slipping, and the reality of her mother's deception was starting to poison her memories. Every time she looked at a photo of herself as a child, she didn't see Shane. She saw Grant, the man who had taught her how to drive, the man who had cheered the loudest at her soccer games, and the man who had quietly paid for every single comfort she had ever known. She realized that Shane Miller didn't know her favorite color, didn't know she was allergic to shellfish, and didn't know the name of her best friend. He was a stranger with a biological claim, while Grant was a father with a soul-deep commitment. One night, sitting in the library, Chloe broke down. She realized that the space she had asked for was now a vast, cold canyon that she had no idea how to cross. She was the daughter of a billionaire-minded man who had nothing, and the stepdaughter of a blue-collar man who had given her everything, and she had traded the latter for the former based on a lie. The legal war continued in the background, a slow-motion car crash of filings and motions. Diane's lawyer had tried to sue for a portion of the house sale proceeds, claiming marital equity, but Sandra Thorne was ready. She produced a decade's worth of maintenance logs where Grant had documented every repair, every upgrade, and every cent spent on the property's appreciation. She presented the Vegas transfers as evidence of Diane's bad faith and financial dissipation. The court was not impressed with Diane's claims. In a preliminary hearing, the judge noted that Diane had effectively lived rent-free for 14 years, while actively funding a third party with her husband's earnings. The judge denied the request to freeze Grant's assets, leaving Diane with nothing but her mounting legal fees. By the time December arrived, the real family was on the verge of collapse. Shane and Diane were arguing constantly, their voices echoing through the thin motel walls, blaming each other for a catastrophe they had co-authored. Grant, sitting by his fireplace in the mountains, didn't feel the need to celebrate. He simply felt the weight of the truth. He had spent 14 years building a house on sand, and the storm had finally washed it away. Now, he was building something on stone. And even if it was small, it was his. By the time the deep freeze of January settled over the Pacific Northwest, the cracks in Diane's real family had become wide, unbridgeable chasms. The motel room had become a prison of their own making. Shane Miller, who had entered the scene with the swagger of a long-lost hero, was now a man stripped of his charm, without Grant Sterling's bank account to fund the lifestyle he craved. Shane's interest in being a dad evaporated like steam in the cold mountain air. He spent less time in the motel and more time at local bars, eventually disappearing for days at a time. The final blow came on a Tuesday exactly 3 months after the text message that started it all. Diane returned from a grueling shift at a local call center to find the motel room half empty. Shane's suitcases were gone. There was no note, no apology, and no forwarding address. He had taken the last of the cash Diane had hidden in her jewelry box and hitched a ride back to the desert. He had treated Diane and Chloe exactly how he had treated them 14 years ago, as inconveniences to be abandoned the moment the price of staying became too high. Diane sat on the edge of the stained mattress, the silence of the room ringing in her ears, and finally felt the full, crushing weight of her own choices. She had traded a mountain of granite for a handful of dust in the mountains. Grant Sterling was finding a different kind of silence. The divorce proceedings had reached their inevitable conclusion because Grant had meticulously documented the siphoning of funds to Shane, and the sole source funding of the home, the court's division of assets, was lopsided in his favor. Sandra Thorne had called him with the news that morning. "It's over. Grant, the judge signed the decree. You keep the proceeds from the house. Your retirement accounts remain untouched." And the alimony request was denied based on her documented financial misconduct. "You are legally a free man." Grant had thanked her and hung up, expecting to feel a surge of triumph. Instead, he felt a quiet, somber relief. He went out to his woodpile, the rhythmic swing of his axe providing a steady heartbeat to his thoughts. He wasn't the man he was 14 years ago. He was harder, leaner, and wiser. He had learned that you cannot buy love, and you certainly cannot negotiate respect. He was finally breathing air that didn't feel heavy with the expectations of people who didn't truly see him. However, the past wasn't quite done with him. Chloe, desperate and drowning in the reality of her mother's poverty, had finally managed to track down the location of Grant's cabin. She had spent weeks questioning his old co-workers and finally found a mechanic who had seen Grant's truck in the small town of Kulalum. One Saturday afternoon, as the sun was beginning to dip, behind the jagged peaks, a battered old sedan pulled up the steep gravel driveway of the cabin. Grant stopped chopping wood, his axe resting on a stump, as Chloe stepped out of the car. She looked thin, her face pale against the dark fabric of her oversized coat. She looked at the small, rugged cabin, and then at Grant. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind whistling through the dry pine needles. "I didn't know where else to go," Chloe said, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with the cold and the shame. She's not okay, Grant, and Shane is gone. He just left us again." Grant didn't move toward her. He stood his ground, the handle of the axe a solid barrier between his old life and his new one. "I know he left, Chloe. Men like Shane Miller don't stay when the well runs dry. I knew that 14 years ago, and I knew it the day you sent that text." Chloe winced as if he had struck her. "I was stupid. I thought I was missing something. I thought having my real father would make me feel whole. But I was wrong. He didn't care about my grades or my life or anything. He just wanted a place to stay." She took a step closer, her eyes welling with tears. "Can I come in? I'm so cold." Grant looked at her, the girl he had raised, the girl whose scraped knees he had bandaged and whose broken heart he had mended a dozen times. He saw the child he had loved, but he also saw the young woman who had stood by and watched her mother attempt to erase his existence. He realized that while he had forgiven the child, he could not yet trust the woman. "You can sit on the porch," Grant said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'll bring you some coffee and a blanket, but you're not coming inside. Chloe, not today. Maybe not for a long time." He walked into the cabin, leaving her standing in the snow. He realized that this was the final part of his healing, the ability to say no to a person he loved because he finally loved himself more. He brought out a heavy wool blanket and a steaming thermos, setting them on the porch bench. He sat in his own chair, a few feet away, and they sat in silence as the stars began to poke through the indigo sky. Chloe cried quietly, the reality of her lost safety finally sinking in. Grant watched the horizon, knowing that he would help her. He would ensure she finished school, and he would make sure she didn't starve, but the team was gone. He was no longer the silent provider who took whatever scraps of affection were thrown his way. He was the owner of his own life, and the entry fee for his world had just become a lot more expensive. The winter eventually surrendered to a cautious, golden spring in the mountains of Washington. The ice on the lakes cracked and melted, revealing water so clear it looked like glass, and the forest floor began to stir with the vibrant green of new life. Grant Sterling stood on the deck of his cabin, watching a hawk circle high above the valley. A full year had passed since the morning he received the text message that had demolished his world. As he breathed in the scent of damp earth and pine, he realized that he no longer woke up with the phantom weight of Diane's expectations pressing down on his chest. He had spent the last 12 months rebuilding himself with the same precision he used to rebuild an engine. He was leaner, his hands were calloused, and his eyes had a steady, quiet light that hadn't been there for a decade. He was no longer Grant the provider or Grant the caretaker. He was simply Grant, a man who knew exactly what he was worth and was no longer willing to offer a discount. The news from the city reached him in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror. Diane had eventually moved into a small, cramped apartment in a part of town she used to mock. The call center job had become her permanent reality. Without the Sterling shield to protect her, she had discovered that the world was an unforgiving place for someone with a sense of entitlement and an empty bank account. Shane Miller had never resurfaced. The last anyone heard, he was back in Nevada, running the same tired cons on a new set of victims. Diane had reached out to Grant a few times, desperate, weeping emails asking for one more chance or a loan to get back on her feet, but Grant had never replied. He didn't feel hatred toward her anymore. Hatred required energy, and he refused to spend another second of his life fueling her drama. He had simply closed the book. He understood now that Diane didn't miss him. She missed the stability he provided. She missed the man who worked the overtime so she could play the queen. Chloe's journey had been more complex. Grant had kept his word. He had paid the remaining balance of her tuition directly to the university, ensuring she graduated. But the money was no longer a gift given in the shadows of silence. It was a loan, documented and signed, which Chloe had begun to pay back with the meager earnings from her first entry-level job. This new arrangement had done more for their relationship than 14 years of indulgence ever had. For the first time, Chloe understood the value of $1 and the weight of the labor required to earn it. She drove out to the cabin once a month. They didn't talk about real dads or real families anymore. They talked about her career, about the books they were reading, and about the quiet reality of the mountains. The team was gone, but in its place, something sturdier was growing. A relationship based on the truth of who they were, not the roles they were supposed to play. One afternoon, Chloe sat on the porch with him, watching the sunset. She looked at her father, the man who wasn't her biological kin, but was the only anchor she had ever truly known. "I used to think you were just there," she said softly, clutching a mug of coffee. "I thought the house, the cars, the life, I thought they just happened. I never realized you were the one holding the sky up for us." Grant looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment before he nodded. "It's a common mistake, Chloe. People notice the roof, but they rarely think about the foundation until the ground starts to shake. I spent 14 years being a foundation that nobody wanted to see. I'm done with that. From now on, I only build for people who are willing to help lay the bricks." Chloe nodded, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I'm learning to lay bricks, Dad, I promise." Grant eventually sold the cabin and bought a larger piece of land further north, where he opened a small, high-end restoration shop. He became known as the man who could fix anything, the man who spoke little but meant every word he said. He met a woman named Elena, a local park ranger who had her own scars and her own strength. Their relationship wasn't built on grand promises or expensive cruises. It was built on shared hikes, quiet dinners, and a mutual respect that required no effort. When they walked through the woods together, Grant didn't feel like a ghost. He felt seen. He felt like a man who had finally earned his own peace. As the second anniversary of his erasure approached, Grant found himself back at the riverbank, where he used to sit and watch the water slide over the rocks. He looked at the Mississippi, then at the life he had built in the mountains, and he smiled. He realized that the text message from Diane hadn't been an end. It had been an extraction. It was the universe pulling him out of a burning building before the roof collapsed. He had lost a house, but he had found his soul. He had lost a real family, but he had found a real life. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked back to his truck. He didn't look back. He had a shop to open, a woman to meet, and a future that belonged entirely to him. He was Grant Sterling, and he was finally, irrevocably home. If you've ever been the one holding the sky up, while everyone else ignored the weight on your shoulders, remember Grant. Remember that silence isn't weakness, and leaving isn't losing. Sometimes, the only way to win is to stop playing a game where the rules are rigged against you. Pack the truck, sign the papers, and keep going. The horizon of respect is waiting, and it's a view you deserve to see. 3 years had passed since Grant Sterling walked away from the wreckage of his former life. On North Ridgeway, time in the mountains moved differently. It wasn't measured by the frantic ticking of a household clock or the persistent buzzing of a demanding phone, but by the slow turning of the seasons and the steady growth of the pines. Grant had transformed a small, rugged cabin into a sanctuary of stone, glass, and steel. He had built it with his own hands, ensuring that every beam was straight and every foundation stone was set deep into the earth. It was a physical manifestation of his new life, unshakable, honest, and entirely his. His business, Sterling Iron, had become a quiet legend among classic car enthusiasts. People traveled from across the country to his mountain shop, not just for his mechanical genius, but for the calm, stoic presence of the man himself. Grant had become a master of his craft and a master of his own silence. He no longer felt the need to explain himself to anyone. He lived by a simple code. He did good work, he kept his word, and he never allowed anyone to take up space in his life who hadn't earned a seat at his table. On a crisp autumn afternoon, a familiar car pulled into the gravel driveway of his shop. It was Chloe. She was 25 now, a woman who had spent the last few years working her way up from the bottom of an architecture firm. She didn't arrive with demands or tears this time. She arrived with a quiet respect. Beside her was a young man named David, a teacher with a kind face and calloused hands. As Chloe introduced him as her fiancé, Grant saw the way David looked at her, not as a provider to be used, but as a partner to be cherished. Grant shook the young man's hand, feeling the solid grip of someone who understood what it meant to build something meaningful. He invited them into the shop, where the air was thick with the scent of oil and old metal. They talked for hours about the future, about the house Chloe wanted to design for herself, and about the lessons she had learned while paying back every cent of the tuition loan Grant had provided. The team Diane had tried to build on lies was gone, but in its place, a real bond had formed between Grant and the girl he had raised. It wasn't the blind love of a child, it was the earned respect of an adult. Before they left, Chloe stepped away from David and looked at Grant with a hesitant, searching expression. "Mom asked me to give you something," she whispered, pulling a small, crumpled envelope from her pocket. "She's living in a studio apartment now, Grant. She's working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. She's broken. She wanted me to tell you that she finally understands. She wants to see you, just once, to apologize." Grant looked at the envelope, but he didn't reach for it. He didn't feel the surge of anger he once had, nor did he feel the familiar tug of guilt. He felt nothing but a profound, hollow distance. "Tell her I received the message, Chloe," Grant said, his voice as steady as the mountain range behind him. "But tell her that the man she wants to apologize to died the day she sent that text. The man standing here today doesn't have any old debts to settle, and he doesn't have any room for ghosts. It was the final, absolute closure. He wasn't punishing her. He was simply acknowledging that their paths had diverged so far that they no longer existed in the same world. He handed the envelope back to Chloe, untouched as the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows over the valley. Chloe and David drove away. Grant stood in the doorway of his shop, watching the red glow of their taillights disappear into the trees. He walked back toward his house, where a fire was already crackling in the hearth and Elena was waiting with 2 plates on the table. He sat down in the head chair, a chair he had built himself, a chair that no longer felt like a burden. He realized that the greatest victory wasn't the money from the house or the legal win in the courtroom. It was the fact that he could sit in the silence of his own home and feel completely at peace. He had survived the erasure, he had survived the betrayal, and he had emerged as a man who was finally, irrevocably whole. The story of Grant Sterling didn't end with a grand gesture or a dramatic confrontation. It ended with the quiet, rhythmic sound of a man living a life he had earned. He was no longer a ghost in someone else's story. He was the author of his own. If you like history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.